in the same category. It's like, oh, those are artsy people. They don't do business.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, actually, there's a whole business element to the art world too. So I'm very excited to dive into that.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're in the UK, so I appreciate, accommodating all the time zones and everything. It's always nice to talk to people from different parts of the world. That's what's so amazing about podcasting, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So let's dive in. Shamsiya, do you want to introduce Adam?
Yes, of course. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Failure Decoded. Technology and business startups have now come together to create value and impact never been envisioned before. Startups now face inconceivable challenges and are vehemently trying to innovate and evolve. It is a race against time, where some are successful, but most are not even aware that they need to be prepared. Hence, this now puts the spotlight on leadership and leaders. And our guest today, Adam Kingle, is an expert and authority in all those spheres. He's a speaker, author, and he's an advisor, and his expertise is sought for all areas of leadership and, of course, the future of business. His books, Next Generation Leadership and Sparking Success, revolve around how innovation and success are dependent on creating strong, disruptive, visionary leaders. What was seen as a skill to achieve breakout performances is not the case anymore. The need of the hour are leaders who can leverage change to transform organizations. And that is why we have Adam Kingle here with us, and he's going to share with us all the strategic and innovation management ideas that he has come up with based on his experience, observation, vision, research. And he lays it down for people in ways of innovative ideas, guidance, frameworks, and brings fresh perspective to build resilient leaders of the future. I welcome Adam Kingle here. Thank you so much for joining us and for breaking stereotypes of what leaders should be, and also for challenging it in my own head. I used to think I'm a good leader, but not so now. So let's learn from you. Welcome to the show, Adam Kingle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Shamsiya, you're a good leader. What are you talking about?
Yeah, that's before I started interacting with people and managing people. It's a different ballgame.
Yeah, that is true. And maybe Adam can help with some advice. I'm sure he can.
There's nothing like followers to make us confront our ability as a leader, isn't it?
Yes.
All right, so Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in your own words?
Sure. Well, my original career was in the arts. I worked in theater, film, television. First on the creative side, then on the business side. And I guess it was from those early years that I suspected that when we apply creativity in business, that there's something to be learned from those artistic media, from those highly successful leaders in creative organizations that you could apply to any industry, even so-called traditional industries, and any function. So I gradually moved into academia, into consulting, into executive education. So now I'm an adjunct faculty at a number of institutions, I guess notably University College London School of Management, and I live here in London, and Hult International Business School, but I'm an author and advisor and keynote speaker.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited to have you here today. And, typically we do talk a little bit about failure, so eventually we will dive into that as well. But perhaps we'll start with some softballs to start, but before we dive into our failure topics. But I'm wondering, so now that you've studied so many leaders in the creative space, what would you say is one of the top key characteristics of leadership that someone in those so-called traditional spaces that you kind of mentioned could learn?
I guess two qualities that come to mind are humility and curiosity. We, I think, have a misconception about leadership that it somehow derives from one's expertise. And that may be fine if your environment is not volatile. But I can't think of anyone anymore who says that their business environment isn't constantly changing. So the problem is, I think, still too often we hope that our leaders have all the answers based on their experience. But if today's context is different from yesterday's context, then that experience may or may not be helpful. So I think a much greater capability is the ability to say, I don't know the answer at this moment, but I can quickly adapt and pivot, which is actually something that we lose, that our solutions to new problems become ossified as we get older and we become more senior. Instead of saying, no, I have to have more plasticity in my approach, more adaptability. I think we know that the standard deviation in year-on-year profits of top global companies is increasing every year. What that means is that yesterday's profits are a poor predictor of tomorrow's profits. So you can't rely on those venerable strategies that you used yesterday for tomorrow. So that ability to just think more like a child and say, let's explore, let's find out. And yes, maybe we have to find out as quickly as possible, is much more of a rare quality in leaders that I think we undervalue.
What was your first tryst with leadership? When did you realize this is something I need to bring to the people, and I see that everyone's failing at this, or most at least?
Yeah, when I was making that transition from the creative side of media and entertainment into the business side, first I was brought in by companies to talk about strategy or marketing strategy. But actually, when you talk about strategy, you are inevitably talking about leadership, because it is the leadership community that is either going to make this strategy successful or unsuccessful in its implementation. So actually, whether I was talking about strategy or not, ultimately I was talking about leadership, culture, leadership capabilities, etc. And so I started just moving ever so gradually into those areas, and as I found that those capabilities were applicable in any industry, I became less of an industry specialist and more of an industry generalist, and my specialism was the capability rather than the industry.
Ooh, never thought of it that way. Yeah, I think that's very unique about you. You bring different perspectives and insights. It makes you want to sit and think, which now is very relevant when you talk about how creativity is important for innovation. I mean, years back, maybe my parents would have been just brush it under the carpet. Like, no. But now I think we're understanding how important that is and how every organization needs to implement that. So do you have any unique stories that you can share with us that you've, learned or seen firsthand?
About creativity.
And how that can impact your innovation or organizational success?
Well, I guess it's helpful sometimes to think of organizations that we know somehow. And so when I returned to some of the organizations that I studied in writing Sparking Success, I was looking at highly successful creative companies that we know, but then look at what don't we know? How do those leaders make those organizations paragons of creativity? And what are the micro habits that they use every day? So in other words, we think, for example, Pixar Animation Studios is creative because we see the creative product. Well, that's not why they're creative. That you're just seeing the outcome of a culture of creativity. Now, how do the leaders foster a culture of creativity in that organization? That's hidden. That's the secret sauce. So that's what I was trying to get to in my book, is I wanted to get the recipe for the secret sauce, right? I wanted to pry open the safe and get the recipe for creativity, right? The Coca-Cola recipe of creativity. And for an organization like Pixar, what I experienced when I visited there was extreme humility. In other words, leaders and producers and directors and animators are actively encouraged to share their work, no matter how rough it is, no matter how first draft it is, and sharing it in order to get feedback and welcoming the critical feedback, here's how you might improve that feedback. So a mantra at Pixar is actually the word display. In other words, always put up your work. It doesn't matter how rough and ready it is. So you'd see just, by people's desks and their offices, there are lots of pin boards and screens, and people just have work up. So that if you're just walking by, you might just on a post-it write, oh, here's I like this. Here's what you might do with that, and just put it up there right away. So then, you're constantly getting feedback. They used to only do one film like every couple of years. Now they're developing multiple films per year. They try to put out at least 2 films per year. As a result of that, then you have multiple production teams. Now, you could think of those production teams as individual silos, but they think actually it's a great opportunity to get one production team in to talk about and be critical of another production team's work, because they don't have the blinders, right? They haven't been sort of immersed in the soup of that one production where they lose kind of the big picture, or get too emotionally invested in some of the creative decisions that they make. But that all requires them to be completely open to suggestions, criticisms, even throwing entire scenes out, or even like half the movie out. In the case of, I think it was Toy Story 2, it's still fairly early in their career. As they were developing it, they realized actually we don't have it. This isn't going to be the movie, and they, critically, confidently said we're throwing out at least 50% of this and starting over on that.
It's interesting that you mentioned environment, like having a creative environment helps foster innovation. And that just reminded me so much. Like when I worked in the film industry, everyone's desks was just covered in posters and like personal like photos, and it was colorful, and it was just so different than a traditional office environment. Whereas I went to visit my husband's office recently, and he works in real estate, and everything is just beige and gray. Yeah. It's like stark lighting. It's just such a different environment. So I'm wondering, like, if you're looking at like a creative environment versus a more traditional office space, like how can you get people in those traditional office spaces to kind of open up their minds and think creatively? Because I think there is this thought, like, and Shamsiya kind of mentioned it, like, oh, well, I'm not creative. Like my parents would never think that. It's like, I'm in engineering or I'm in this field. Yeah. That's not creative. I don't paint. I don't sing. Like I don't do art stuff. But it's like creativity applies to anything. So I guess like how would you kind of coach a client in that situation where like maybe they don't view their office or their industry as something that lends itself to creativity?
Yeah, there are a couple of deep questions in what you ask. I mean, first, this element of do we assume that we're creative? We cannot collate our self-perception of ourselves as creative with what we do professionally. We are all paragons of creativity. The late, great Professor George Land at the University of Minnesota issued creativity tests, of people sort of, of hundreds of children aged 3 to 5, and found that 98% of them scored as creative geniuses. So that tells us we all have this, right? We all, but we work it out of our systems somehow as we get older, be it through school, be it through profession, be it with how we're managed. So I think that's the first concept. The second concept is, so how do we get it back? And you're absolutely right. A lot of it has to do with the environment. You're absolutely right, in your experience looking at film companies. I remember recently I visited Industrial Light and Magic in San Francisco, and everyone's desks, what I noted, were covered with toys. Not only were they just, like action figures and whatnot on the films that they work on, but in picking it up and just handling it, playing with it, you're kind of sparking new ideas in your head. And it does, yes, also remind you to be playful, to be creative, etc. But we all need to be creative, regardless of our profession. If you might have to create a new product or service, that's creativity. You might have to sell a house to a client where you think, actually, I'm not going to be able to sell this to them in a way that I ordinarily do. They're just a different person. They require a different approach. That's a creative strategy that you have to implement. We have to change our strategy. That's a creative act. We have to re-engineer our management methods. That's an act of creativity. There's a new disruptive technology in the market. What do? Your response is an act of creativity. So I don't care what profession you're in. You do have to practice creativity. You may be good or bad at it, but everyone has to be creative to be successful in any industry, in any business. So how do you create the environment? Well, I mean, I guess first thing is to note is it really does, the physical environment does affect the stimulus around us, and therefore how creative we might be able to be. So when I spoke to writers, creative writers, sitcom writers, screenwriters of films and whatnot, what they said is one of the main things that they did to unlock creativity was go on a walk. or just move into a different room, change the environment. If you've ever been in a garden, particularly like a Japanese garden, you note that it's in different zones, right? Like there are different aesthetics in different parts of the garden. And the Japanese phrase for that, when you move from one zone to the other, is change feeling. And that's the idea when you move from one room to maybe walk outside or go from one room to another room. Just what's around you changes the feeling. And that creates new thoughts in our heads, whether we like it or not. So it's automatic. You see this in all kinds of other industries and businesses. Urban designers would tell you when they're designing cities, how do you make sure cities are models of hubs of innovation? Well, one of the things that they recommend is they say keep the blocks short. What do they mean by that? Keep the blocks short. Well, if the blocks are short, then when you're walking in the city, you have more temptation to go off in different directions. If the blocks are long, you can't turn off. And so you just have to be forced with being confronted with whatever's next as you're walking. But if you always have different routes you can walk, you always have new stimuli. And those cities, what they found, are actually more creative as a result of that. So yes, it's absolutely true. We cannot conceive that we can have the same conversations, asking the same questions with the same colleagues in the same beige boardrooms, and somehow all of a sudden get different answers. So maybe start with changing the beige boardroom or getting out of the beige boardroom and changing it up. So there is a lot in, we know neuroscientifically that alone can make a huge difference.
Wow, that's really nice. Amazing. It just brings to my mind that we are redefining what creativity is now. It's not the traditional definition. So right. I think we need experts like you. And I don't know why you're calling yourself a generalist, but I think you are an expert. And maybe, what you're saying is, do you have another word for it, or it's just creativity? That's what you call it?
No, I think actually when we talk about concepts like adaptability, being more inspirational, these are all different lenses of creativity.
I feel like
agility is another.
I think it's very important right now. I come from a science background. I have a PhD, and there was a lot of research. I spent years and hours in the lab, but now I feel like there's a mental block, and I feel like the only way I can create newer projects or work on different projects is by painting, is by, doing some writing or blogging. And it really helps. And it somehow triggers my scientific part of the brain just by doing those things. So yeah. I think what you're saying is just making so much sense to me right now.
Oh, good. Well, you're right. Sometimes even that changes the feeling. You're making new neural connections in your brain. If you're saying you're working in, whether in science and technology, management, whatever, if all of a sudden you pause, write a poem, read a book, doodle, that sparks new creative connections in your head. That can help you when you go back into your project or your business or your experiment. You will think differently about it.
So what do you think should leaders be doing, or potential leaders be doing right now, so that they become that, there's a wholesome kind of like neural development, and they also become impactful leaders? Is there a strategy now?
Well, it's not one thing, but we've talked about something. One is think about the actual physical environment of your space, for sure. The other part is try to create different connections. We talk about neural connections, but create different pockets of connections within your organization, right? So if you think an organization, you need to shake them up and they have to be confronted with new ideas, put someone else from a different department into there. It doesn't even have to be permanently, Have someone from marketing join the engineering team meeting if they're talking about a creative challenge. Introduce new perspectives into that conversation. Another way is to ask the team to confront the challenge in a different way. So rather than ask someone to come and talk about the challenge, maybe have them come and first draw it. Let's just draw what we think the problem is, and so let's see if we even have the same concept of what the issue is that we're trying to crack. These are all, sometimes I call them micro habits, because sometimes they're little things, but sometimes little things can make a huge difference. Like throwing a pebble into a pool. The ripples are much more profound than the initial stimulus. these little tricks that I learned from creative leaders are often super helpful. Another really easy one is, if you know you're going to have a creative conversation or brainstorming meeting, pose the challenge to your people before you start the meeting. Don't introduce the challenge when they're in the room. Because for a lot of people, they need to cogitate on it for a while they're sleeping, while they're eating, while they're playing the piano, etc. So give them that time to marinate in the problem, and your answers will be much richer and much more diverse when they come in. Because if you don't do that, when they come in, the most dominant personality or the hippo, the highest paid person in the room, they will state their opinion, and everyone else will simply just gravitate to that opinion and build on that. But if you let everyone think about it first, you'll have more willingness for everyone to share their diverse opinions once you start the conversation.
I do love that approach. I actually was just listening to a podcast last night where someone was talking about that, and I think they called it like the Delphi method, where they essentially, someone poses the problem, everyone has to write down their thoughts about the problem, and they have a 4-hour time limit or whatever the time limit is, and then all at once, their responses get released. So it's like that way you're not creating groupthink.
Right.
We're having the
Exactly.
CEO influence everyone, because you're totally right. Like if the CEO says something, everyone's going to be like, oh, they must know, right? Because they're the CEO. Of course,
they're the experts.
But that's not necessarily true. A lot of times the CEO is wearing, many hats. They're trying to oversee like every department. They're actually not necessarily that close to the problem. So I do like that approach. And I feel like not many people do that. Like
It's completely right. And unfortunately, let's take, for example, marketing, right? So let's say someone's a great sales and marketing person. So then they get promoted and they look after sales and marketing people. And that goes very well. So then they become the CEO. So now by this point, it's probably been 20 years since that person has actually talked to a customer, has actually had to sell something to a customer. And yet they are still making strategic decisions based on their perception of a customer 20 years ago.
Yeah.
They are one of the least knowledgeable people about making good marketing decisions anymore. So when I am wearing an advisor hat, when I go in, and like a board will ask me, or an exco, help us to have better, more innovative conversations. You're absolutely right. One of the first pieces of advice I give them is the senior most person in the room needs to shut up and just listen. Do not be the first person to state your opinion, because everyone is going to pivot and anchor what they say next around what you said.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And that kind of leads into one of the questions I wanted to ask. And it's, what do you think one of the most common leadership failures is? Like, what are you seeing right now where like someone in leadership, either maybe they're, biased about something because, for example, you're right. Yeah, 20 years ago they were dealing with customers, but now in like the current landscape, so many things have changed. Like, is there any like common failure that you're seeing among many organizations that, new emerging leaders should look out for?
Yeah. Well, one is definitely that point of we invest far too much authority in someone who is senior, who isn't frontline, who isn't talking to customers, who isn't close to the products and services. That's a big fail. Another one is that in thinking about how do we create new ideas, a big fail that organizations make is that they default to making tiny improvements to existing initiatives, products, or services, rather than ever give themselves the time and the space to think about the supernova idea, the rebellious idea, the one that's going to change the industry or create, mega new profits for them. Why? Because it's safer to say, well, this product works, so now let's be innovative. And all they end up doing is a tiny, tiny tweak to that product, right? Because then it's safe. It's going to work. And then a year later, you can say, look at this ROI on our innovation. Now the sales of this product have gone up 0.003%. Victory! Instead of, how about introducing a brand new product, into the marketplace? At least give yourself the time to consider that. But the fail is organizations think it's too risky to be truly innovative. So all they do is they innovate around the margins. And as a result, their total innovation quotient is also extremely marginal. Yeah.
I mean, we had Samuel West on our podcast, who curated the Failure Museum. And it's a super interesting museum because he, finds like artifacts and products of all these like failed innovations. There's all kinds of like weird, interesting stuff on there. But he was kind of saying that like unless your organization develops what he calls psychological safety, where people feel like they're allowed to fail, there won't be any innovation. And that's basically what you're saying is like, if you're going to get in trouble for failing and you're worried about getting fired or ridiculed or whatever, you're not going to innovate on anything. There's going to be no innovation. No. And that's like such a dangerous place to be in as a business, especially to be competitive.
That's right. And a lot of us might feel that's the case, but I wanted to know if that was the case. So I interviewed 200 HR directors in Europe. I surveyed them and I asked them, what is your organization's attitude toward failure? And I gave them 5 options. Well over 50%, almost 60%, fell somewhere into a very negative space around their organization's attitude. It was something in between, like on the most radical is like if you are perceived to fail in any manner, you're fired, all the way through still a negative attitude toward failure, like, okay, we won't fire you, but there's sort of a stigma, or we won't speak of it again, and hopefully it'll never happen again. That's where most of them fell. So of course, then if they turn around and they say, oh, Adam, why aren't we more innovative? That's why. You've just answered your own question about why you're not innovative.
Yeah. And you also talk about how constantly failing kind of builds your portfolio up and propels you forward. It's almost like it's important to fail and create that.
Absolutely. There's a huge assumption that somehow truly innovative ideas are fully formed lightning bolts of inspiration that strike our heads from the hand of Zeus himself. And it's like, oh, I have a brilliant idea, and I write it down, and I submit, and it's perfect. That almost actually never happens. Generally, stories of successful innovation are stories where we brainstormed 100 ideas. And at first, none of these 100 ideas look any good. Then we go back to them, and we tease them out a little bit. We talk about them. Oh, actually, maybe these 2 out of these 100, maybe there's something there. So you develop them a little further. You talk about it, maybe do a little prototype, maybe you run a little experiment. Oh, actually, this one, there is something there. And you develop it further and you iterate it, and it becomes this mega, innovation. That's how innovation typically happens. So you have to go through the mess of thinking of 99 bad ideas to come up with the one good idea. If you wait and you say nothing until you are struck with the one brilliant, perfect idea, it won't come. Because actually those good ideas are hitting your head all the time, but you have to sift through a lot of other ideas in order to get to it. One of the people that I interviewed in Sparking Success is the former head writer or showrunner for the TV show Friends. And he said, when you have to write that many episodes on a highly successful sitcom, and you're under such pressure, your writers, your writing team, have to come up with lots of bad ideas. So his main job was not to come up with good ideas. His main job was to encourage everyone to put out every idea they can think of, because he knew only about 1 out of 20 ideas were going to be developed further. So his job was to encourage every writer to every day come up with 21 ideas, right? And then maybe one of them will be good and will wind up in the next episode.
Yeah, I absolutely love that approach. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about other organizations' failures, how comfortable would you be sharing perhaps a failure that you've experienced in your career, and how that's led to, either a learning opportunity for yourself or, something that you'd be willing to share that might help, once again, future leaders coming up to look out for?
Yeah, I did an MBA at London Business School, and that was a great experience. It was so good I ended up working at London Business School for almost a decade. But of course, as you can imagine, most MBA programs in the world, certainly in my experience, it was very quantitative. And I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, but the assumption that can foster is that the only way to get to insight and to new answers and to be better leaders is through numbers. And that is a way, and it is a useful way. But also, even how you use numbers, how you might manipulate data science, what methods you choose, these are all acts that come from intuition, experience, creativity, etc. So it's always a blend. So I've always thought that as I finished my MBA, I thought actually there's a risk here. I'm going to go too far into solely being like an analyst boffin. And I actually did make that mistake for a while. I actually became far too enamored of trying to find find the numbers. And I think now in my writing and in my research, I always try to combine a sociological approach, observation, interview, with feelings, asking people about what they feel about things, with then backing it up with data, trying to get some statistics behind, to back up an intuition I have, etc. But I often find that, particularly with like fresh MBAs or people with any business degrees, is they get very left-brained. And I'm not being pejorative about that, but as human beings, I think, again, we are all also supremely creative beings, and we have to find balance.
I completely understand that, and I hope in future you can create a program for people who do not want to be, caught up in all the numbers, because many times I wanted to join MBA classes, but I look at all these accounting and finance modules, and I'm like, I don't think I want to get into that. I don't think I will be able to tackle that. I want to do a little more on the practical side. There are hardly any course out there. You have to take up, I don't know, diplomas or something like that. But if you would ever start a program of that sort, let me know. I would definitely know.
I'm sure there are maybe whole degree programs on things like creativity and innovation. I'm thinking like the D School or the Design School at Stanford University, right?
Yeah.
But even within MBA programs, now, I did my MBA 20 years ago. Now, you are at least start starting to see classes in MBA programs. Maybe they're electives rather than part of the core curriculum, but classes in creativity, innovation, etc. And that's heartening.
Yeah.
Wow. Absolutely. And there's one course, I think University Arts College of London, I think they have innovation and management, entrepreneurship. They're pretty on the creative level, and they teach social entrepreneurship, which is very interesting. I might really look into that.
It's a big reason why I'm on the faculty at UCL, is because you're right, entrepreneurship and innovation are huge parts of their culture. Yeah.
I just have a very curious question. What are the distress calls? What are the reasons companies and organizations actually have to call you and say, we are not able to solve this, please help us understand this? So can you just list out some?
Well, funny enough, they don't call me because they have a specific problem, like we need to create a new product, or we're facing this huge technical disruption, so we need you to help us solve that. That used to be, when I was a management consultant, that was why I was brought in. But now it's much more people realize there's something they need to work on in their character, in the character of the corporation, right? We need to develop our innovative capacity no matter what the challenge or the opportunity is, or we need to change or alter or refine our leadership capabilities no matter what the challenge tomorrow is. So now I'm dealing much more with organizations who realize that they have a DNA level adjustment that they need to make, rather than help us with this one specific, business need.
Yeah, just to wrap up, I do have one question, because I know you talked a little bit about this. I saw a video that you did on it. And it kind of is just an interesting turning point. And it's basically like now, millennials, and I think you even mentioned Gen Y too, are quote unquote getting past the baton from, older generations. But every generation, I feel like, has a different working style and a different, understanding of like their greater purpose in life. And I'm just like interested to ask about that. You kind of talk about like purpose over profits and how important it is to focus your organization on having more of a purpose. And you also mentioned like the stakeholders versus shareholders. And I'd love you just like to dive into that a little more, because I feel like that is kind of a newer concept, but I think that's going to explode, just given even like now that Gen Z is coming into the workforce too. I just think there's going to be this really big shift, and it sounds like you've already been doing some research on that. So I'd just be curious to, as a final question, just to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to. In fact, this is the subject of my first book, Next Generation Leadership, which I wrote 3 years ago. And it's all about looking at the youngest generations in the workforce, particularly Gen Y or millennials. I use that term interchangeably. That's the biggest demographic in the workforce. In 2 short years, Gen Ys, millennials, will compose 75% of the global workforce. So we had better understand what their paradigms are about work, careers, life, and leadership, because this is basically, then you understand the vast majority of the global workforce as well. And one of the most important things for Gen Y is purpose. Organizations that have a strong lived sense of purpose. The important word is lived. It's not just like, oh, we've written a nice phrase about what our mission is, but you see it in the choices that we make, the trade-off decisions that we make every day. It's Princeton University did a study, and they found that 85% of their graduates are looking for a job with an organization that has a strong lived sense of purpose. But to your point around stakeholders versus shareholders, for too many years, we assume that if you're going to go under under the purpose trap, that you're going to be doing a disservice to your shareholders because you can't possibly be as profitable if you're going to be mission focused. But actually, there's lots of new research over the last 10 years which indicates that those organizations that are purpose focused do better than their competitors in terms of profitability. So these concepts are correlated. It is not a zero-sum game. There's a wonderful book called Firms of Endearment. That's Firms of Endearment rather than Terms of Endearment, the movie. And they looked at publicly traded companies that had strong purpose and values. And they looked at how their share price performed over a decade. And they found that their share price performed 10 times better than the market and therefore their competitors. That's really compelling. If you look at asset management and pension funds, their social responsibility funds have vastly outperformed the normal funds on average over the last 5 to 10 years. So that is also indicating to us, right, that purpose can equal profit rather than it's one or the other. So this is a really exciting time, right? We don't have to think about CSR as a compromise. It's an accelerator to business success. And the people that showed us the way, funny enough, were our youngest employees who were caring about this stuff before anyone else in senior positions in the organization cared about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'd love to see it. Yeah, as a millennial, it's great that, finally, I guess your thoughts around it are influencing, big decisions. So that's great to hear. And I love that term, the stakeholders versus shareholders. Yeah. It's just really cool.
It's very cool. And the senior leadership is willing to listen and learn. I think that's also pretty cool, right?
That represents an evolution. Yeah. I think senior leaders are learning. They are learning that they should be listening, not just telling their younger employees what to do. And that represents a new way in which the workplace is being formed. If you want to know what the future of work will look like, talk to your youngest employees, because of course when they assume leadership of those positions in their companies, they will lead those organizations in the way they wish they had always been led. So a very simple way to understand what the future of work will hold is talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can the audience find you? Do you want to shout out your website? We'll put it in the show notes, of course, but if there's anywhere they can follow you on social or check out your books.
Of course, yeah. So I have 2 books out. Next Generation Leadership is one. Sparking Success is the second. They're both out now. Hopefully, online or real-time retailers near you. I have a website, which is just my name, adamkingle.com. Where you can see a lot more media about me, about my speaking. I've got videos, podcasts, webinars, you name it on there. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Adam. This is a very great conversation to hear all about. Really, just it was kind of eye-opening. I think the creativity element and putting that into traditional workplaces. I feel like Shamsiya and we always talk about, kind of joke, I have the arts background, she has the PhD in science, so it's really interesting. I feel like you're kind of the perfect guest for us to talk to, because it kind of merges both worlds together, so it's kind of interesting. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.